Hello, 8th grade. This is Mr. Crutcher again. And as you can recall in Section 1, Kennedy's Foreign Policy, we talked a lot about communism and the fear of communism. Well, that's plays a big part in Section 2, War in Vietnam. That's what's going to lead us to the U.S. getting involved with Vietnam. Now, as you can see up there at the top title, I just used this because this is what was in the book, but it's really, these next three slides are causes of the war. Now, Vietnam, it was a French colony that had been captured by Japan during World War II, and when the war was over, Japan obviously was defeated. The Vietnamese looked forward to their independence. However, the French were not prepared to give up the colony. So Vietnamese forces led by, and you can see the picture there, Ho Chi Minh, fought against the French for their independence, and eventually they were defeated in 1954. Okay, another cause, we had the Geneva Accords, and the Geneva Accords was a meeting of nations. It was the U.S., France, Great Britain, Soviet Union, China, and Vietnam. They met in Geneva, Switzerland, and they came up with this agreement. And according to the Geneva Accords, Vietnam would be temporarily divided into North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And now in North Vietnam, you would have the communists would be in control. South Vietnam, you would have the non-communists in control. And Vietnam would reunify in 1956 after national elections. Well, the problem was, with U.S. support, the South Vietnamese leader, Ngo Dinh Diem, refused to hold the elections. And a large part of that was in fear of the communists winning the elections in South Vietnam. Also continued the Geneva Accords. Communists in South Vietnam disapproved of Diem's policies and brutal tactics against people that opposed him. And when he tried to destroy the forces working against him, they formed the National Liberation Front, or better known as the Viet Cong. And in 1959, the Viet Cong started a war against the Diem regime. Growing American role. The U.S. supported South Vietnam because of the domino theory. Remember, we talked about in Section 1 how communism might appeal to the countries, especially if they're poor countries. And you can see in the picture here, the theory is that if one country falls and another one falls, and they just fall down like dominoes. And this started with the Eisenhower administration, and he had sent South Vietnam billions of dollars in military advisors, hoping to stop the spread of communism. And like we mentioned in Section 1, Kennedy continued the support. He sent more military advisors and pressured the Diem regime to make reforms that would eliminate conditions that had spurred communism. Well, the problem was Diem refused. And aid continued to flow from North Vietnam to the south to fuel the guerrilla war against Diem. So you have North Vietnam, which is communist, helping out the communists in the south, trying to go up against Diem. And the Kennedy administration, they fought hard to continue to support Diem, but it was getting more and more difficult to do so. And in 1963, the South Vietnamese military overthrew the government and assassinated Diem. Now, Kennedy supported the coup, but not the assassination, and then he would later regret even supporting the military group that overthrew and assassinated Diem. And right here you can see this is a picture of a Buddhist setting himself on fire. And Buddhists were about the majority of the people in South Vietnam, and Diem, that was one of the groups he targeted because he was Catholic, and so by what they did, they would burn themselves in the street just by a sign of a kind of like a protest. Now the conflict deepens. We know that JFK was assassinated and President Johnson becomes president. Johnson was more, he wanted to be more involved. He wanted the U.S. to be more involved, I should say, with the war. He sent Robert McNamara, which was the Secretary of Defense, to Vietnam and to get information. Now, Johnson, he didn't think that at first Vietnam was worth all the heavy military involvement, but the U.S. continued to get sucked in or drawn into the conflict because of the communist takeover by the North. Okay, we get more and more communists in South Vietnam trying to take over. So Johnson, he wants to get involved, but the problem is the American people, their view of the war is starting to where they're not totally for it. So he needs a way to get the United States to be able to get more involved. And he gets that with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Now, what happens in 1964, North Vietnamese naval forces attack a couple of U.S. destroyers. 2 days later, and that's why here it says allegedly attacked U.S. ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. I say allegedly because it was reported that, but it was mistaken. Johnson gets wind of this. He asks Congress. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And the resolution basically allows the president to retaliate against any armed attacks on the U.S. forces. Now he can send more troops. And there was already a plan in place which involved a lot of bombing for the North before this happened. And like I said, he used this resolution to escalate or gradually increase U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Now, one target of the bombings was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And this trail was just a network of roads, paths, bridges connecting North and South Vietnam. This trail was bombed because North Vietnamese troops used it to bring equipment to South Vietnam. You have bridges, docks, factories, military in the bases north. Those were some of the targets that were bombed. Fighting war. This was a difficult war to fight for the U.S. because one, they're in unfamiliar territory, but this ground war, they would be in dense jungles, muddy trails, swampy areas, and it made troops movements difficult. You got to think of the temperature, the weather. It could get up to almost 120 degrees. And another big problem is that the Viet Cong blended in with the rest of the population. So it was hard to tell friends and enemies apart. You didn't know who was a part. Somebody might act like they were a friend, but they were part of the Viet Cong. And another problem was that the America's allies, the South Vietnamese military, didn't fight effectively. And here are some pictures here. You can see in the jungle, there's walking through some water, swampy lands there. Here, you can see it's almost chest level, walking through all that water. This is a picture of a person showing you, we talked about guerrilla warfare. Well, this person is down in a tunnel, and you could see how when they use this guerrilla warfare, they would attack and run back. They could hide down in these tunnels, or we talked about how they could do ambushes. They could pop out and ambush the soldiers as well. Okay, now fighting the war. Lethal weapons were used in this war also, and besides, just the bombs, planes dropped napalm, which was an explosive that burned intensely. They also used a toxic herbicide called Agent Orange, and this was used to destroy the jungle vegetation that the enemy used to cover with. They also had search and destroy missions. Now, these were from American soldiers, I believe Australian and New Zealand also. And here's a picture. You can see a soldier pulling this soldier up who's helping this guy out of the tunnel. And what they would do on some of these missions, this particular mission here, these soldiers were called tunnel rats because they would go down in the tunnels. They would look for North Vietnamese or Viet Cong and destroy them. Now, frustration grows. Like I said, the war's carrying on, and the U.S., they did cause an enormous amount of Viet Cong losses, but it wasn't enough. And the Johnson administration began to believe the U.S., that all these ground battles and the air attacks, even with all this, they still could not win the war. Like I mentioned a few seconds ago, it was taking too long. Public opposition to the war began to grow. Now, here are some questions to consider, to think about. Number one, why did the United States become involved in Vietnam? And then number two would be, why did American forces find fighting in Vietnam difficult? So we'll discuss those questions on Tuesday. Okay, and now that concludes section 2. We'll talk about section 3, which talks more about life in America during the Vietnam War.